And welcome to This Week in Creationism, episode number 29. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here's where we take a look at the headlines in the world of creationism from the past week. This week, we take a look at Walter Brown's hydroplate or liquefaction theory, which fails a young Earth creationist ichnofossil test. We're also going to talk about how Is Genesis History needs your financial support so they can finish up their follow-up to the Is Genesis History movie. All of this and more coming up. Let's turn our attention first to Answers in Genesis. I was hit with this particular headliner on their website a week ago, Trace Fossils Challenging a Flood Model. Now, what hit me when I saw that title? Well, the title is Challenging a Flood Model. Answers in Genesis believes in a global flood, and they have a particular model of how that flood resculpted the world only approximately 4,500 years ago. And here they're talking about how trace fossils challenge a flood model. What flood model are they talking about, and how is it challenging that flood model? Let's find out. So this comes from, and this is a link to an article that they published in their Answers Research Journal, their technical journal of creation science. And here we have the author Edward Isaacs, who's written a number of times. He comes from Genesis Apologetics, which is another creation apologetics group out in California. And he's written this article, Ichnofossils Refute Hydroplate Theory's Liquefaction Submodel. Ooh, sounds pretty fancy. Maybe a lot of words in there that you don't know if you don't know this particular model or what an ichnofossil is. So let's start. Ichnofossils are a subset of biogenic sedimentary structures that include a range of sedimentary disruptions, impressions, excavations made by animals. Basically footprints, okay? Things left behind that are evidences that animals were there, all right? They dug a hole. They plowed through some sand, right? They made a nest and it got trapped and got fossilized. Right, all these things are ichnofossils, so not fossils of the actual biological organism itself, or remains of a biological organism itself. So that's the first word, ichnofossils. Refute hydroplate theories, liquefaction submodel. Okay, what's this a reference to? I have not talked about hydroplate theory on This Week in Creationism, nor have I written about it very much on my blog. I've generally ignored hydroplate theory, but this hydroplate theory was relatively popular back in the 1980s, I'll say 1990s. I rarely hear about it anymore, but I do run into people once in a while that were enamored with hydroplate theory in the past and maybe haven't read any of the other like young Earth creationist material to realize that most young Earth creationists have sort of moved on from this hydroplate theory thing. But nonetheless, I find it interesting that Answers in Genesis has published an article that is, in this case, refuting, all right, pretty strong language there, saying they're going to present evidence that the hydroplate theory, and specifically a portion of the hydroplate theory called liquefaction submodel, cannot be correct, cannot be the correct interpretation of the geological column. Before we get into Edward Isaacs' evidence that he believes refutes hydroplate theory, maybe we should say a little something about what hydroplate theory is. Now, in his abstract, you'll see here it says, one of several competing models, right? Among young Earth creationists, there's multiple different models of how the flood was both initiated, how it came to preserve all the different fossils in the relative order that they're in, and also how the flood was ended and what the post-flood era looked like, right? There's all these different models, and we're going to look at how Is Genesis History in their next movie that they're asking for funds to complete is going to be looking at that last question. What did the post-flood world look like, and how do we recognize it? But here, you were recognizing that there are multiple competing models, and hydroplate theory was proposed to simulate the initiation and ensuing tectonics of the global flood, or the Genesis flood. So hydroplate theory was more particularly interested in like what initiated, how did this giant worldwide flood begin? Hydroplate theory posits that wave-induced liquefaction sorted strata, while subsequent tectonically induced liquefaction resulted in the succession of funnel forms and the presence of cross-stratification throughout the fossil stratigraphic record. Woo! That's a mouthful. Basically, the continents shook a whole bunch. The plates that are on the surface of the Earth moved so fast that it vibrated the Earth, and in that vibration, it created liquefaction. All right, liquefaction is like when you go to the beach and you jump up and down a whole bunch of times, and all of a sudden the sand becomes quivery, right? And the water begins to get squeezed out of that sand, right? And you might start to sink into that sand because of it. Right, and on a much larger scale, you can have buildings and large objects get sucked down into basically kind of like a quicksand, right? And then in some cases kind of stratified inside of that sediment. And you can form layers of sediment as a result of this liquefaction. You can see the attraction of the idea of liquefaction. If you did this on a global scale, you could basically shake the Earth up after a whole bunch of soft sediments have been laid out because of all this water running around, which in hydroplate theory, you have this massive amount of water that comes from underneath the continental plates. That's where the original water was stored in, I haven't even mentioned who this is, Walter Brown's theory. And this water and then spews out, let's get to it right here. You have the subterranean sea, and it's sitting down below the continental plates. And then you have cracks that occur in the Earth, and then this super pressurized water, right, is going to then get released through the cracks, and it's going to come out so fast, right, it's going to erode the continent around where these cracks are very, very quickly, throw up massive amounts of rock and sediment into the air, not only into the air, but actually all the way into outer space, according to Walter Brown. And some of that water that goes into outer space, along with large rocks that go into outer space, become the comets and meteorites, right, that are out there, which are then impacting the Earth later in time. This is a pretty wild theory, as you might be getting the gist if you haven't heard of this before. Right, all that extreme amount of water falls back to the Earth, and it also erodes the continental surface. So now you have lots of sediment running down, and then also you have these continents start slipping and sliding around after all this water release. And through that, you have this massive amount of vibration that then takes all the sediments that are sitting on top and basically jiggles them down. And then that essentially squeezes the water out of it. All right. Again, imagine you're on the beach and you're jumping up and down. You basically jiggle the water. Not very scientific language, but you get the idea, right? That the water gets squeezed out of that sand. All right. And so there's less water content when you're done. And that's part of his rationale for why all the sediments then are able to turn into rocks very quickly afterwards to form all the sedimentary rocks. All right. Now, at the same time that's happening, any organisms that have been trapped in these sediments and through this chaotic event, well, they're going to get liquefied as well, and they're going to get sorted out. And he kind of has like smaller to larger items, and they're kind of going to move through the different sedimentary column and might actually get moved to different places. And that gives the appearance of sort of a simpler organism to more complex organism later on. I mean, there's just vast number of problems with this idea, which we're not even going to bother get into. But nonetheless, liquefaction, it is a relatively simple sounding model that on the surface of it and to the average non-scientist, it has been appealing, and it was appealing in the 1980s and 1990s. Very appealing to a general young earth creationist leaning audience. And Walter Brown was very effective at communicating with that audience and gave his book to many pastors, and pastors recommended it and so forth. So it caught on really as a sort of a grassroots level sort of book. And Walter Brown, let's go back here. So here's your author. This is, and when I say hydroplate theory, it really just fits with this one person, right? This is the creation of a single individual, Walter Brown, and look at his credentials here. He has a PhD in mechanical engineering from MIT. He taught college courses in physics, math, computer science. He was in the Air Force and worked in various laboratories. And then ever since he retired, eventually became convinced of creation science, and then devoted himself to trying to explain the flood. And he wrote this book in the beginning. And this is like the collection of all of his research and thoughts. In the beginning the original version was written in I think the year 2000, and I think that's right. I don't have time to look up right now, but I think it was year 2000. Here's my copy right here. This is the 2007 edition. I have the 2002 edition, but it's not with me in my office here. And the 2002 version is about half this size. And it's just kind of grown over time. And now he's up to the 8th edition, which was published in 2008. I've been asked many times if I've read this book. In fact, very early on when I started to think about young Earth creationism, and I've had many young Earth creationist friends, this is really one of the most popular books recommended to me at the time in the middle 90s. So his credentials, he's not exactly a geologist, but he's very much like Henry Morris, right? He's an engineer, and he applies sort of an engineering mindset to this whole idea of can we make the rocks that we see, and his idea and make them fit his interpretation of the biblical record. So he comes up with this hydroplate theory thing, which kind of is an early adaptation of continental plate theory, right? Continental drift, that plates are moving around. He was an early adapter or acceptor of that among creation scientists, who now generally have come around to there's some kind of plate tectonics, even if they don't think that it took as long. Walter Brown was kind of like this idea of plate tectonics is this really super speed thing that happened right toward the end of the flood year. All right, so this is the book, and this is the material that this author at Answers in Genesis is criticizing. Now, I shouldn't say this author at Answers in Genesis. He's with Genesis Apologetics, another apologetics group, but they submitted a paper to Answers in Genesis. I'm pretty sure they were more than willing to publish this paper in their journal because Answers in Genesis doesn't have anything to do with Walter Brown and hydroplate theory. And when I look through my book and I look at a long list of people who recommend it, he's got a whole bunch. Sorry, I'm covering my microphone. He's got a whole bunch of people who have recommended the book. And I just looked over it for the first time in a number of years. And I was a little surprised that I hardly recognize any of the names. But then as I start to look closely at them, I realized that very few of them are scientists. A few of them are engineers. They're all people who are outside of Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, and Institutes for Creation Research, which are your primary creation science apologetics ministries. And most of the people that recommend the book are pastors. All right, so ministers who have read the book and, say, well, this is a great way to explain the biblical flood to, my congregants. And so that's where he has gotten his recommendations, more so than from other scientists. He's been, as you'll see, criticized for good reason among other young Earth creationists, but for a long time was a very popular promoter of creation science. Okay, now I'm starting to sound repetitive, but I'm kind of leading up to this point that what's I'm just actually thinking about this right now as I'm talking, right? I hadn't planned this, but as I think about my impressions of Walter Brown and how much influence he had at one time, it makes me realize how young earth creationism can actually undergo sort of paradigm shifts, because Walter Brown was a huge influence. And today I feel like he has virtually no influence other than those who are older, and this is what they had learned. But he's no longer able to sort of be the influencer he was before. So I kind of think like how this fits with like Answers in Genesis. They're the 1,000-pound gorilla on the street right now. This is what most young earth creationists, congregants in a church who might be recommended. Here's something. You have questions about this? Oh, go to Answers in Genesis and get your answers. This would have been in the beginning, in the past. This book would have been one of the big influences in the past. So it just shows that, names like a Walter Brown or like today, a Ken Ham, can have a lot of influence. And then 15 or 20 years later, they're kind of lost, right? There's going to be another name. There's going to be another model that comes up that becomes more popular. And one of the reasons I'm fairly confident that that will happen is because every one of these models have serious flaws. And it's easy for one creationist to point out the flaws in someone else's view. But at some point, the flaws in one's own view become too heavy to bear, right? And there'll be another theory, right, that hasn't been tested as well. There'll be another hypothesis that will sound more appealing because it has fewer obvious problems, at least initially when you look at it, and will become popular, right? And there'll be another person who will popularize it, right? There'll be another politician-style leader who will manage to win over a lot of individuals and will become their particular view will become popular in the future. And this is just sort of the way that these types of things go. Okay. All right. Spent way too much time talking about this, but that's what This Week in Creationism is for. It's sort of, what do we see happening in the world of creationism, and thinking about what has gone before and what's going to kind of go ahead. And much of what I'm doing is admittedly speculation, but some of it's speculation at least based on a lot of experience. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about this article. What does Isaac say? How does he refute hydroplate theory, and specifically the liquefaction portion or submodel of hydroplate theory? He does it very simply, very clearly, and very convincingly. And he does it with ichnofossils. He's saying Walter Brown can't explain these things. He has a whole bunch of pictures in the paper. I'll just show you a couple of them. Here is a sauropod track. This sauropod track, I know it's not very exciting looking, right? And this is the way a lot of fossils are, right? They're not nearly as glamorous as the ones we like at. But these are just as important in terms of the information it provides in our interpretation of Earth's history. Essentially, this is a sauropod foot walking along on these layers of sediment, soft sand at the time. And remember, they're really big creatures that are very, very heavy. And they're impacting and pushing down on this sand. And what happened was it pushed down those layers below it, right? Compacting those layers. And we're seeing it sort of on a side view now. And so this is, and you might say, oh, how do you know that was a foot that did that? For one thing, what else would make marks like this? But an easier way of doing it is, and they're not showing in this picture, but if you go down these layers, there's going to be multiple of these punctures that push through multiple layers of sandstone, or sand layers at the time. And the multiple different impressions, all right, are in the form of, 4 feet walking along. All right, so pretty good evidence that that's an animal walking along that's doing that. All right, now, how does this refute hydroplate theory and liquefaction? This is in the middle of the sedimentary column. And what Walter Brown does is he, in his attempt to explain why there are many, many different layers of different types of sediments, tries to explain them all through this kind of liquefaction thing and this settling. The problem with the settling is, and liquefaction is, that any footprints that were made, right, at some point in soft sediments, the liquefaction is going to remove those footprints. It's going to remove things like, here's little tiny burrows, right, in the upper Cambrian, right? These are small little burrows of tiny organisms like worms that actually work their way through sediment. So as more sediments are laid down, say on a beach or actually probably shallow sea, and more sediments were deposited, then these things dug up through those. And then more sediments laid down, dug up through them, or came across and dug down into them. And then their burrows got filled with different sediment, and that's why we see these structures now in the geological column. These are ichnofossils because they're not the actual worms or other organisms that might have made these burrows, but they are evidence that an organism was here at this moment in time. Now, if the sediments and the patterns of sediments were created by liquefaction, the burrows wouldn't be there anymore, right? Even if they were there at one time, they would have been obliterated by the liquefaction process. And so Isaacs, is, he demonstrates that there are basically ichnofossils throughout the fossil column, all around the world. And so it's can't be true that liquefaction is what caused these things. Liquefaction postulates continue to be forward as one of the strongest cases for hydroplate theory, yet this paper has found the case to be internally inconsistent and conflicting with the ichnological record. Because ichnofossils are merely superficial impressions along or subsurface voids within the substrate, ichnofossils are particularly susceptible to destruction through the reorganization of the sedimentary fabric, and that's what Walter Brown is talking about, the reorganization of the sediments laid down by the flood. As such, ichnofossils are already a problem for any creationist, right? How did dinosaur footprints get laid down in the middle of a global flood when there's thousands of feet potentially of sediments below them, and then there's hundreds or thousands of feet of sediment above the fossil footprint, and yet somehow a dinosaur walked across this surface while there was massive amounts of sediment being deposited. There are millions and millions and millions of dinosaur footprints among other types of ichnofossils. Ichnofossils are a problem for creationists, but Isaacs is exactly right to say that ichnofossils are a very serious problem and really do refute the liquefaction aspect of hydroplate theory. As such, hydroplate theory struggles to explain ichnofossil production at the surface, coercing hydroplate theory to suggest trace fossils were produced in subsurface liquefaction lenses. Right? So they were somehow made below the surface rather than at the surface. They're at the surface, they're going to be obliterated. Somehow they're going to be made by the liquefaction process. That seems not possible. This, however, not only leads to various conceptual contradictions, but fails to explain the terrestrial vertebrate ichthyological record. Furthermore, the entire terrestrial vertebrate track record and its close correlation to the body fossil record must be produced before the compression event and subsequent massive liquefaction, eliminating the need for massive liquefaction to produce faunal succession. Okay, sorry, a lot of words there. Okay, I love this point about entire terrestrial vertebrate track record and its close correlation with the body fossil record. Not all body fossils, in other words, fossils of the actual organisms that made the ichnofossils, like let's just stick with footprints. Not all of them are always found tightly correlated with each other in the fossil record, but many of them are very close. Just generally, think about dinosaurs. Where do you find dinosaur footprints? You find dinosaur footprints in rocks that are where you find dinosaur fossils. You don't find dinosaur fossils above the KPG line, right, 66 million years ago. And you don't find dinosaur footprints in any of those rocks that are above that particular line. You don't find dinosaur footprints before the Triassic. And you don't find dinosaurs or remnants of dinosaurs before the Triassic. And we could do this with lots and lots and lots of different organisms. You find trilobite tracks where you find trilobite fossils. You don't find trilobite tracks above a point where the last trilobite body parts are found. Right? You could do this 1,000 times and you get that same kind of pattern. And he's exactly right. Liquefaction, if it's sorting the body parts in the fossil record, how could it sort the body parts such that there's a correlation with the ichnofossils related to those particular body parts? I mean, that would be an amazing correlation. And so most other creationists recognize that that you had to have ichnofossils have to represent something that was made by a particular organism at a particular time, somehow during the flood. And then you wouldn't be shocked if you found the actual organisms also related to those because they were in that particular location at that particular time to make that ichnofossil like a footprint, and then maybe succumbed not too much later. So maybe their body parts are found just above those footprints. All right, so you don't really have to spend a whole lot of time with this paper to realize that he has a very simple argument, but it's very powerful. He powerfully shows that liquefaction just doesn't make any sense, and it's not a model that young Earth creationists should be looking toward to explain the fossil record of the geological column. Let's move on. Creation.com, and this is pretty easy. I'm not really going to talk about any of these articles from creation.com. They're all actually old articles except for complex tRNA subsystem part 3. So this is just a long series of articles about how amazing transcription and translation are. And so therefore they must be the product of design. And it's just showing amazing biochemistry. And then at the end saying that must be design. And that's the only way it could have formed. The other articles here, many of them are old. I don't know what's going on in young Earth creationism at the moment, but Answers in Genesis have pumped out a whole bunch of they've republished a whole bunch of old articles. I mean, they all do this because they all have something new on their website every day. So there's always something new to read. And there's always going to be a certain percentage, which is just like taking something old and then bringing it up and like republishing it. But there's been an especially large number or a large proportion of the articles have been republished units. And I don't want to say that's because young Earth creationists have run out of new things to say. I don't think that's the case. But I do think that it might be partly the time of year. They know that maybe readership is a little bit lower right now, so they're not wasting like the good material, on us. So a little disappointing from my perspective because I would like new things to read, because for the most part, I look at what comes up each day and I go like, wow, I know I've already seen that because I've seen almost everything that has ever come up on a young Earth creationist site at some point. Answers in Genesis. They're Ken Ham on Ken Ham's blog. They're pretty proud of the fact that they've won a whole bunch of EPA awards, and that's not even that's not the Environmental Protection Agency. All right, so they're not winning awards for their museums because of their great environmentalism, and I'm not saying that they're not environmentalistic in any way. I just thought it was kind of funny, the EPA awards. No, it's the Evangelical Press Association Awards. And they just announced their 2022 award winners, and they have, they've got like 50 categories of things they give awards out. And yes, Answers in Genesis won a whole bunch of awards. I'm not going to go down the list. You can go to the Ken Ham's blog and you can see all the different winners. Most of it was, they won second or third or fourth place, but they won first place in a couple categories. You'll see that first one right there. Our Answers in Research Journal that's their peer-reviewed technical journal, won first place in biblical exposition for Terry Morton's article, Theistic Evolution, A Response to Wayne Grudem. To me, that kind of tells you all you need to know about the Evangelical Press Association. Really. Right? I mean, Terry Morton's article is not a very good theological treatise. And Terry Mortensen is not a theologian. And here he's being given first place for biblical exposition. This is the best they could come up with. Of all the stuff written out there in this last year, this is what the Evangelical Press Association gives first place to. I looked up the Evangelical Press Association. It's a little hard to tell exactly who's involved in that, but I would say it's a very, I'm not going to say far right organization by any means, but it's definitely on the right end of things, and very much in the mode of, Answers in Genesis is great stuff. And so, of course, they're looking at all their material, and they gave awards to all kinds of Answers in Genesis material throughout. And more interestingly to me, looking at the other winners, I have to admit, I didn't really recognize hardly any of them. Didn't recognize the blogs. I didn't recognize the different websites they were talking about. And I'm not unconnected to the evangelical world by any means. But I'm not in that particular portion of the evangelical world. And so it's definitely a particular subset of evangelicals that this particular association is related to and interested in. All right, let's get to Is Genesis History. Now remember, Is Genesis History is, I have trouble describing this. It's a I don't want to call it an organization, because it's really Thomas Purefoy, who is the producer of the film Is Genesis History, which is a film/documentary that was shown in theaters on special dates. And I saw it in the theater. And then it's been a very popular video. And then after the film was made, which brought together creation scientists from a number of different organizations, and especially a number of different independent groups. And if you want to know more, you can go to my blog, and I've written several blog posts about Is Genesis History and sort of the history of it and my impressions of how it's different than, say, Answers in Genesis and other creation ministries. And so I am calling it a ministry now, because after sort of making this film, which then other creationist organizations sold. So it was originally it was kind of a service, right, to the creation science community, and really a passionate project of one person. And after that, though, they sort of kept together and brought back together people they had featured, young earth creations that were featured in the film. And they had them do a whole series of videos. And out of that began to grow a website, isgenesishistory.org. And probably .com too. And that particular organization kind of has grown into a whole body of works that you can purchase, not just the film, but also video series, and a whole bunch of articles. And now it's spun off the New Creation blog, which I've referred to on This Week in Creationism multiple times, in which they have novel articles that are written there. And so it's kind of I think of it as a growing influence, right, in the world of young earth creationism. Well, they announced a year ago, and I've talked about it, I think, on This Week in Creationism early on, maybe episode 3 or 5 or somewhere very early on. And they had announced at the time that they were filming a follow-up. And the follow-up was Is Genesis History, Mountains After the Flood. And this is supposed to look at the world of the post-flood world. So when Noah stepped off the ark and the animals departed from the ark and stepped back onto this, essentially a new earth, right? A new creation, as flawed as it was. What did they see? And then what happened as animals started to cover the earth again, be fruitful and multiply, right? They were supposed to multiply and fill the world. There was the instructions given to both Noah and the animals, once again, just very similar to Genesis. And as they went out into this wild and presumably still fairly chaotic world, how did they fill that world? And so it's going to be about how did they speciate? How did they change? How did they adapt? How did organisms adapt? How did the mountains get formed and created? How did the continents move around? And all this is fairly controversial stuff within young Earth creationism. So I've talked in the past about how I think this is going to be a very challenging film to make, because there's, for every 10 creationists you talk to that are sort of experts in thinking about these things, I would say you're going to get at least 9 different answers as to what should be in this film and how it should be portrayed. And so the producer, Tom Spierfo, has a huge job in terms of filtering out how to proceed to present this information to us. Well, now, they announced this like 6 to 9 months ago that they would be having a sequel and it was coming this year. Originally, it was going to be in the spring of this year. Well, it's not the spring anymore. Now it's the summer. Now they're saying possibly the fall. Actually, the website says fall 2022. But in the ad recently here, it says fall or possibly spring or winter of 2023. But that's dependent on you, all right? You need to donate money. Help us finish the sequel. This comes from I think this is from my Facebook feed. And I've been hit with a whole bunch of times, right? I see it like every day now. I'm seeing this ad for Is Genesis History, right? Will you help us finish the film? It talks about how they've mostly filmed, right? They've captured on film a lot of the scenes and the interviews, but now there's the whole production phase, like putting it together, splicing it, music, all that type of stuff, and then marketing, right? So they want to raise an additional $275,000 to finish the film so that they can put it out in front of the audience. So here's their website, Is Genesis History. And here they talk about the film. And interestingly, as I was reading down, it's going to definitely feature Andrew Snelling in the Grand Canyon. And there's going to be a bunch of stuff about, there's going to be stuff about geology. What they haven't talked about much in their preview is anything about biology, but biology will also certainly be covered in it. All right, so if you want to see that come out sooner, I guess you need to break open the wallet and hit your donate button. All right, just one other item for this week. The Yellowstone National Park Part 1 of Flood Supervolcano. I have too much to say about that, and I decided I couldn't include it in This Week in Creationism, so I'm making a special edition of This Week in Creationism that will be just devoted to just Yellowstone National Park Part 1. Have a lot to say about that, so won't say anything more right now. Have to come back for a special edition. The other things that are there, Flood explains mysterious Iceland plant fossils. The Mars rover records dramatic solar eclipse. That's pretty much saying, hey, look, yeah, they found a solar eclipse, but it's not nearly as amazing as the solar eclipse is on Earth. And the solar eclipse on Earth is like exactly the size of the moon covering up the sun. And so that has to be designed, because how could you by chance come up with an exact match of the moon's distance from the Earth such that the solar eclipse is a perfect match with the sun? There's been a lot of discussion of that particular design argument, I guess you could say. The only thing I want to mention is adaptive genetic and epigenetic changes in plants. And if you followed This Week in Creationism and all, you know what's coming. Continuous environmental tracking, right? Remember ICR, and specifically its new president, Randy Galuza. Randy Galuza, medical doctor, medical training / engineer, all right, has devoted ICR to developing a new and novel approach to explaining biological diversity. And he calls that continuous environmental tracking. And I've attempted to explain continuous environmental tracking a couple times, and I'm pretty sure you feel like I've not been clear enough about what it is. I keep pointing it out because every single week on ICR's website, they managed to find some piece of research out there that to them sounds like it is backs up their idea of this CET. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link to another YouTube channel called Creation Myths, Dr. Dan. And he's done a wonderful job of summarizing what continuous environmental tracking is, and and also how it's, well, why it doesn't work. All right. And I've watched his video and I very much agree with his assessment. And I think it's a really well organized way of sort of trying to understand what CET is and how it's unique and specific to Institutes for Creation Research. Because remember, they're basically saying natural selection doesn't exist. Everything is pre-built into organisms such that God provided a mechanism for organisms to see the environment around them and then turn on and switch on various programs that are already pre-installed so that they can change and adapt to the environment around them rather than any form of natural selective process. And this would put them at odds with Answers in Genesis or Creation Ministries International, who do accept natural selection as a force that sculpts and changes organisms over time. It's not worth spending a whole lot of time on this article. I just wanted to, as I've already done, point out that once again, they're going to push this idea of CET, and that's what's in this highlighted section. The researchers labeled the overall response adaptive tracking. Yes, it's useful language at times to talk about how organisms are tracking the environment over time, all right, and adapting to it. So adaptive tracking is not a word that is that any evolutionary biologist would consider to be anti-evolutionary. And they don't mean it, though, in the same way. They don't mean that individuals are adapting to their environment. They mean that populations adapt over time through processes of natural selection, right? And via natural selection, adapting populations over time, the population is tracking the environment, right? So often refer to their findings with design-based lingo such as, and then they quote from the paper that they're talking about Arabidopsis. The phenotype and genomic patterns observed in the study were consistent with a form of adaptive tracking in which populations adapt in response to continuous environmental shifts. Yeah, the environment outside is changing over time. No part of this world stays the same continuously. It's always changing, and organisms have to adapt and change with that. And, well, I should say populations change and adapt along with that. Yeah, you need to go watch that video that I will reference below to get a better idea of what this continual environmental tracking and how it's a misunderstanding of natural selection. And the article they refer to here is really talking about natural selective processes. It's also talking about mutations. And so it's not a program that already exists in the Arabidopsis. It's mutations that are occurring in Arabidopsis, which then give them new capacities to adapt to the environment over time. Oh yeah, I said I only had one more item. I had other items. Let's skip that and let's just go to some fun stuff. Right, so just tracking Ken Ham and his Twitter feed. Here we have him talking about future developments at the Ark Encounter. This photo shows the location of new construction of the Ark Encounter. And so we see we've got, here's the Ark itself, right? And what you do now is you take a bus up here. I was just here a couple months ago. You take a bus up here and you get dropped off right here. Actually, right here. Answer Center. Oh no, this is an old picture that he posted, even though this was fairly recent. Just a second. Let me get rid of this. You come up here, you actually come around here, you get dropped off here. And you can go into this is a large conference center, and they have concerts and all kinds of stuff in there. Fit 1,000 people in there. right? And then you can enter into the Ark Encounter area. This is where the Rainbow Bridge is, or Rainbow Arch. And then you come in, you see the Ark, and then now they've got this the carousel that's being built. That's for kids, where you can ride a pterosaur. And then they have a virtual reality, like movie theater. They've got this restaurant over here. We've got the zoo. And they have a petting area here, but now they're even going to have a new petting zoo all the way out here. And all the way up here, then we've got various maintenance buildings and sort of the maintenance coming. But the reason I brought this up is because he also announced, and I talked about this on This Week in Creationism, that they have seasonal housing, right? They're going to build a compound, right, with houses, dormitories, right, where they can house interns who are coming to help out. And so rather than having them live outside of the area, they can live there. And of course, the advantage of that is they can go to Bible studies and they can be, protected, right? And so parents can let their teenagers come and they will give them the full and, Ark Encounter experience, where essentially they can live here, work here, and be contained in this extremely safe environment. Yeah, I'm overdoing it. I know that others feel like this is kind of I don't even. Yeah, I'll use the word that. This is how how young Earth creationists do their form of grooming. All right. So I know Ken Ham loves to talk about, in his culture wars language, talks about how other groups are grooming children. But in this way, this is a way of grooming young adults to be faithful followers of the young Earth creationist mantra, for the rest of their lives. Really get them involved in it and completely devoted to it. And the other thing from Twitter here, I think the other one was Twitter as well. Here we have Answers in Genesis, really Ken Ham, tweeting, "The majority of scientists didn't believe there would be a global flood in Noah's day. The majority were wrong." A quote from Ken Ham. I'm ending it with this because I just kind of like to end with something on the sort of ridiculous side, right? The majority of scientists didn't believe there'd be a global flood. In other words, everyone around Noah was a scientist, all right, the scientist of the day, who looked around and said, "What are you talking about? The world can't possibly flood." Right? In other words, their knowledge of science, they didn't believe a global flood could happen. Well, the majority were wrong. And this is the kind of talking point that Ken Ham loves to use with his audiences, right? Because essentially, what a young Earth creation is constantly dealing with, they're in the minority, right? They're in a very, very small minority that believe a certain view. For one thing, they're in a minority of believing a particular interpretation of Genesis, and then a minority of how we should interpret the geological column with respect to this global flood, with respect to our interpretation of Genesis. And so they're always in this small minority. And so it's really helpful to always try to find ways to point out where the majority was wrong, because majority has to be wrong if we're right. Okay. That's it. That's This Week in Creationism. I'm going to be back with that special edition talking about Yellowstone. I love talking about Yellowstone. So like I said, I had a lot to say about that. So I'm just going to carve that out as a separate version. But thanks for hanging in there if you're here still. And I appreciate the listen. I look forward to what This Week in Creationism brings next week, because there's always something new and interesting. At least I hope they publish something new in this coming week. But I'm sure there'll be some new developments for us to talk about. All right, till next time, we'll see you later. Bye-bye.